Scott Kelly, thanks so much for being with us.
My pleasure.
So you broke the record for time spent in space, almost a full year there. How do you encapsulate what it is like to be living in space for an entire year?
It's challenging. It's hard. Certainly exciting. There's a lot of stuff that's fun, but a lot of hardship goes with it. Being away from your friends, your family, being away from Earth, particularly the weather, be able to go outside. So, but at the same time, it's the most rewarding thing I think I've ever done in my life.
What does it feel like? Because I realize we can't understand, we're not in it, but when we're watching it, it looks like this graceful liftoff, and we see these calm, serene pictures of you all inside.
Yeah, when the shuttle lifts off, it looks like it's lifting off slowly, but when you're inside, there's nothing slow about it. You get the feeling you're going somewhere. You're really not sure where you're going, but you're not coming back to Florida. And it's a wild ride. 7 million pounds of thrust instantly when those solid rocket motors light.
What are your hopes for where we can go next?
Well, I'm really excited about the Artemis program, and probably within the next 3 years, we're going to send a crew of 4 people around the moon. First time we've done that since the early 70s. That's very exciting, with the goal of 5 to maybe, I don't know how many years later, landing people on the moon. And having a lunar space station in lunar orbit, maybe potentially a lunar base at some times. But ultimately, our goal would be to go to Mars. There's a lot we can learn from going to Mars. And I think, in the immediate future, the next, 50, 100 years, I think that's the big goal, is to put human boots on Mars. So hopefully I'll get to see that someday.
We'll start with the closest goal first, moon landing. Why is it so significant to go back there? It has been, more than 50 years at this point?
Yeah. We can learn a lot for our future mission to Mars. The moon is only a couple of days away versus 200 days away. If you have a problem, you can get home quickly, whereas if you're on Mars, you can't. Take a really long time. The moon is 1/6 the size of Earth, so 1/6 the amount of gravity as compared to Mars, which is 1/3. So less gravity, makes certain things easier for your design of your rocket and your operations and what you're going to learn from that. There's no atmosphere on the moon. That has some advantages. Mars has a little bit of an atmosphere, so it almost seems like it was put there for us to practice with. But also, China has plans to land people on the moon, and in 2029, I think their goal is. So we used this, geopolitical competition during the 60s and 70s to get to the moon. I think there's still an argument to doing, for the same reasons, to go back before the Chinese.
Well, speaking of geopolitical competition, you were on board the International Space Station with the Russians. They were your colleagues up there. What's that relationship like now?
It's somewhat, with some of my Russian friends, it's changed, but not in a bad way necessarily, because some Russians that I know feel very similar about the war in Ukraine as I do and many Americans do. That this is it's wrong. They're committing war crimes. It's a threat to freedom and democracy around the world. So a lot of them that I know feel that way, with one exception, and there are actually maybe 2 exceptions. They're ashamed and they're embarrassed, right, by the whole thing, that their country is doing this. Now there are others that feel like a lot of these ultra-nationalist Russians do, where they feel like they're just defending themselves from how they describe, the Nazis and NATO, this nonsense. And some of these folks that I know are, they seemed at the time to be smart people. They seemed to be good people, good friends, but somehow they've just been completely brainwashed, and it's really sad to see. Hopefully, my hopes are that someday they'll come back around to reality.
You've gotten to know President Zelensky. What do you see unfolding there, and what about his leadership gives you a sense of how this is going to play out?
Yeah, so in the beginning of this war, I was a real advocate for the Ukrainian people. I have some Ukrainian American family members and friends, but I'm also a big believer in freedom and democracy, and I think it's the most important thing that we have. And I feel like the war in Ukraine is not only a threat to Ukrainian sovereignty, but also a threat to just the idea of liberty and democracy, freedom around the world. So I had a big platform, social media platform, as a result of spending a lot of time in space, and a lot of my followers are also in Russia. I wrote a book that was published in Russian, so I felt like maybe I could make a difference trying to give the Russians some real information. So early on in the war, I tried to do that, oftentimes in Russian. Got kind of sideways with the head of the Russian space program after he threatened to leave an American guy in space, and he also threatened like nuclear war and stuff too. But yeah, so that was, and I raised a bunch of money on my own initiative, and that was noticed by the Ukrainians. So they asked me to come on board and help with a fundraiser to raise money for ambulances.
Going back to your time there for a minute, I wonder, do you ever get so used to being there that you stop thinking about the fact that you're living in space?
No, you never really feel completely normal or forget. Even despite the beauty of the Earth and how incredible it is, when you're looking at it for a year from the space station, you get pretty familiar with it. Remember one time I opened a window shade, and very quickly I noticed this sand on Earth, this patch of sand, that just from the texture and the color, I knew it was this little patch of desert north of Mogadishu in Somalia within seconds. And I thought to myself, maybe it's time to come home.
Did your notion of what Earth is and what is happening here, did it ever change when you have that much distance and you're looking down at it?
Yes, so, often astronauts talk about this thing called the overview effect. Orbital perspective, I think I've heard those terms, that basically when you're able to look at the Earth from space, you understand just how fragile the environment is. I mean, our atmosphere looks like a film over the surface, almost like a contact lens over somebody's eye is how fragile it looks. You see parts of the planet that are almost always covered in pollution. Asia, areas in Central America. You know that the United States is one of the biggest polluters in the world, but it's the type of pollution you can't see. It's not a particulate where it would obscure the ground. So you know that pollution is a big problem. You see the rainforests in South America, I noticed over the course of my time in space. Every time I flew, it seemed to get worse and worse. More cleared fields, more burning fields, but you also see the planet with no political borders like we're used to seeing on a map. So it makes you think, hey, we're all in this thing called humanity together. We got challenges around the world with whether it's climate or otherwise, and what happens on one side of the planet can affect the rest of the planet very, very quickly, as we saw during the pandemic. So it gives, I think, a good shift to your perspective on the environment, but also on humanity.
You've had this really interesting pursuit in being back on Earth, that you're visiting places that really captivated you from in space.
Mm-hmm.
What have you discovered? Where have you gone to visit them up close and personal?
There are some places that are really catch your eye from space. The Bahamas are it's such an expansive area of blue. That it just really is incredibly beautiful. So I'd been to the Bahamas before, but I went a couple times after I've been back. There's also these little tiny colorful lakes north of the Himalayas in Tibet. I've been there since I've been back. We've traveled in the last 6 to 7 years a lot of places. that I wanted to go as a result from looking at it in space. The spot between the North and South Islands of New Zealand, that strait, been there. I mean, I've been a lot of places since I've been back, places that I decided when I was in space I wanted to go visit.
And finally, is you're wearing the NASA pin the signal to NASA that you'll go back at a moment's notice?
I'd go back in space, yeah, if I could. Not forever. I wouldn't do the one-way mission to Mars. Not interested.
Scott Kelly, thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, my pleasure.